They call you road trash in the kitchen. They just poisoned your meal. Those 12 words, scrawled in frantic, looping cursive on a cheap paper napkin, landed on the table with the force of a tire iron. They ripped through the rugged atmosphere of the room, a brutalist monument of ink on paper. They stopped Jackson Vance, a man who moved motorcycle fleets with a single phone call, dead in his tracks. His hand, holding a steak knife heavy enough to be a weapon, froze an inch from a $50 piece of prime rib. For a legend of the asphalt who had stared down rival clubs, navigated treacherous interstate politics, and built a multi-million-dollar custom chopper empire from the rusted scrap of his Texas childhood. This was a different kind of war. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't strategy. This was a violation, primal and deeply personal. And it was about to detonate a story so dark it would stain the checkered linoleum floors of an entire franchise. What's the worst thing you've ever seen happen at a roadside stop? Drop a comment below right now. Let's talk about the silent things we're forced to witness on the highway. And while you're down there, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of the reckoning that's about to unfold. Jackson hadn't come to the pit stop for the food. He'd come for the truth. Dressed down in a faded denim vest, dust-covered jeans, and a pair of scuffed engineer boots he'd owned for a decade, he was a ghost haunting his own machine. He was here, undercover and utterly anonymous, to investigate a series of whispers that had thundered all the way up to his headquarters in Austin. The pit stop, a jewel in his roadside hospitality portfolio, a flagship diner he quietly owned on a popular route in Arizona, had been flagged. An anonymous email, detailed and desperate, spoke of anti-biker bias, a toxic kitchen culture, and a management team that treated riding patrons like dirt under their boots. Jackson Vance didn't delegate investigations like this. He didn't send suits and clipboards to sanitize the truth. When a sickness festered in one of his establishments, he believed in finding the source of the infection himself. No road crew, no fawning assistants, no special treatment. From the second he had pushed open the heavy steel doors an hour earlier, it was sickeningly clear the whispers weren't just rumors. They were policy. The hostess sized him up with a barely concealed sneer, her eyes cataloging his leathers as if they were a personal insult. He was seated at a cramped, wobbly booth, tucked away by the noisy swinging doors of the kitchen, a corner of the diner reserved for social lepers. He was then ignored pointedly for 17 full minutes. The floor manager, a man who strutted through the dining room like a rooster, made a grand show of skipping his table entirely. And now this napkin. A desperate flare sent up from a waitress whose eyes, when she had briefly met his, were pools of quiet terror and fierce dignity. Her name tag said Sarah. She wore the exhaustion of 1,000 shifts on her young face, and her sneakers were worn through at the soles. She didn't ask for help. She didn't make a scene. She simply delivered the truth, folded and damning. And that truth didn't just crack the rustic veneer of the pit stop, it shattered it, exposing a poisonous, rotten system hiding in plain sight. This isn't just a story about a bad meal in a roadside diner. This is a story about the courage it takes to light a match in a room filled with gasoline. It's about what happens when one person risks their entire livelihood to do what is right. It's about the hidden, insidious architecture of prejudice that still haunts the open roads of America, and how the bravery of one young woman forced a titan to remember the boy he once was and the rider he was supposed to be. This is a story of raw justice. And if you've ever wondered what it truly looks like when the powerless fight back, you're about to find out. Settle in, because the next 20 minutes are going to fundamentally change the way you think about power, brotherhood, and what can happen when a simple paper napkin becomes a declaration of war. Jackson Vance was a master of control. At 48, he had meticulously crafted a persona of untouchable calm. He was one of the most powerful and respected figures in the motorcycle industry. A self-made man who had clawed his way from a garage with a leaking roof to a manufacturing plant with his name on it. He was a mechanical prodigy who had taught himself engineering from discarded manuals, an investor who could smell fear and opportunity in the market like a wolf smells blood in the wind. He had built Vance Motor Holdings not just on the back of his genius, but through a relentless, almost inhuman discipline. Every move was calculated, every word was weighed, every contingency was planned for. He didn't believe in luck or fate. He believed in torque, in precision, and in the unwavering dignity of a man who knew his own worth, even when the world told him he was just grease monkey trash. But all the data in the world, all the blueprints and projections could not have prepared him for the 12 words Sarah had slipped under his coffee mug. Long before that night, long before the millions and the custom choppers, Jackson knew the bitter metallic taste of being judged. He was raised by his uncle in a tiny, unincorporated town outside of Lubbock, a place where the dust never settled and opportunity was a foreign language. He'd watched his uncle, a man with hands as tough as worn leather, work himself into an early grave at the local mechanic shop, so that Jackson could have boots without holes and tools that weren't rusted shut. His first bike was a broken-down relic he'd pieced together from a salvage yard's junk pile. His first major investment wasn't in stocks, it was in himself, a technical trade school fund he established for kids from his hometown the moment his first custom shop went national. A move that baffled his corporate partners. But success doesn't erase the scars. It just gives you nicer leathers to cover them with. On paper, he was Jackson Vance, the visionary founder of a sprawling empire with assets in parts manufacturing, touring logistics, and roadside dining. He commuted on a custom all-black Softail, sat on the boards of 3 major automotive companies, and lived on a ranch that offered a god's-eye view of the Texas hill country. But in the quiet moments late at night when the highway slept below, he was still that greasy kid who had to practice shaking hands in a gas station bathroom mirror before his first meeting with investors, praying they wouldn't see the fear in his eyes or the grease under his nails. He never wore flashy watches or designer logos. Jackson understood with a bone-deep certainty how quickly and brutally the world judged a biker by his appearance before they ever bothered to listen to his mind. So when that anonymous email about the pit stop had landed in his secure inbox 3 weeks prior, he didn't dispatch a team of lawyers. He didn't engage a crisis management firm. He fired up his bike, put on the clothes of the man he used to be, and rode straight into the belly of the beast. No one gave him a second look when he walked into the pit stop that night. And that was the entire devastating point. To truly see the nature of a system, you have to become invisible to it. That was a lesson Jackson had learned the hard way. He wasn't just a CEO tonight. He was a mirror held up to the face of his own creation, and he was about to force it to look at its own ugly, unfiltered reflection. Because real power, he knew, wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing what everyone else desperately pretends isn't there. The pit stop was designed to make you feel welcome, theoretically. Housed in a renovated vintage service station on one of Arizona's most famous highways, the diner was a temple of Americana. Neon signs, gas pumps flickering with faux nostalgia, and a pervasive scent of burgers and old oil hung in the air. You didn't just come to the pit stop to eat. You came to celebrate the road, to be part of the journey. The walls were adorned with black and white photos of historic rides and famous bikers, their names proudly displayed on brass plates, as if the culture was being honored. The name itself, the pit stop, was meant to evoke images of refuge and camaraderie. But to Jackson, even before he knew the depths of its rot, the name rang with a different, more sinister echo. A pit was a hole. a place where things were discarded. It was the architectural embodiment of a trap. From the moment he stepped across the threshold, the performance began. The hostess, a blonde, bored young woman whose smile was as bright and artificial as a roadside billboard, ran a contemptuous gaze over his dusty vest and helmet. He was not the family-friendly tourist they wanted, and she made sure he knew it. He was a glitch in her perfectly curated matrix. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" she asked, the sir dripping with condescension. "No," Jackson replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. She sighed, a theatrical exhalation of practiced annoyance. "Well, we are fully booked this evening. However, I suppose we might have a small booth available near the kitchen exhaust. Will that be acceptable?" Her tone made it a punishment, not an offer. Jackson simply nodded. Perfect. He followed her across the checkered floors, a silent shadow trailing through a sea of tables occupied by tourists in minivans and clean-cut vacationers. Families in matching t-shirts and retirees in RVs laughed and drank, their voices a low, oblivious hum. He counted. Not a single other biker in the entire establishment. The only other leather vests belonged to a group being turned away at the door by a bouncer. Some things, it seemed, never changed. She deposited him at the booth, a vinyl seat barely large enough for his frame, pressed up against the wall, where the rhythmic clatter of the kitchen pans provided a constant jarring soundtrack. The air smelled of bleach and burnt onions. She didn't offer a drink menu, didn't smile. She just dropped the laminated menu on the table like a challenge and walked away. Jackson sat, a statue of patience, and observed. He watched the waitstaff, their smiles brightening, their postures straightening when they approached the tables of the families and the RV crowd. He watched the manager, a burly man named Mr. Miller, with a buzz cut and a sweaty upper lip, glide between tables, shaking hands, pouring coffee, his laughter obnoxiously loud, but his eyes slid right over Jackson, a transparent wall of deliberate disregard. Jackson felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The pit stop wasn't broken. It wasn't having an off night. It was operating with flawless, brutal precision, exactly as it had been designed to by this crew. It wasn't a diner. It was a stage for a play about exclusion, a place where the culture on the walls wasn't honored but exploited, where the biker past put on a costume and still demanded to be called history. Sarah Jenkins moved with a practiced economy of motion, the quiet, efficient grace of someone who understood that to survive in a place like this, you had to take up as little space as possible. At 23, she possessed a weariness that didn't belong on a face so young. But behind her tired eyes, there was a sharp, defiant intelligence. A fire banked low, but not extinguished. It was the look of a wrench carefully wrapped in a rag. She had once dreamed of being a motorcycle mechanic, of fixing the machines that gave people freedom. She was a star student at the local technical college, halfway to her certification. When life intervened with the casual cruelty of a blown engine, her father, a former rider who'd worked for 40 years as a truck driver, was injured in a bad haul. The medical bills began to mount, a tsunami of debt that drowned her tuition and savings. So she did what she had to do. She put her dreams on hold, packed a single toolbox, and came home to work the only job she could find that paid in cash tips every night. That job was at the pit stop. The money was on paper the best she'd ever made. But the cost was tallied in a currency of 1,000 daily humiliations. Sarah was one of only 2 staff members who actually knew anything about bikes. Management never uttered a single overtly hateful word, but the bias was woven into the fabric of the place. She could feel it in the shift schedules where she was consistently given the Tuesday lunch shift, while her compliant colleagues got the lucrative Friday and Saturday nights. She could feel it in the station assignments, always stuck in the back section by the grease traps. She could feel it in the way Mr. Miller spoke to her, his voice a full octave lower, his instructions clipped and impatient, as if her sympathy for the riders was an inconvenience he was forced to endure. She saw it in the smirks of the other servers when a solo biker would leave her a meager tip after receiving terrible service, a silent, smiling punishment for his lifestyle. She heard it in the kitchen where the head cook, a local bully named Spike, would make casual, hateful jokes about road trash and organ donors when a rider dared to stop for a meal. She never laughed. She never reacted. She absorbed it all, filing each slight away, each casual cruelty, a piece of evidence in a trial no one knew was happening. She wasn't weak. She was a witness. She was surviving. But tonight felt different. The man at table 19, the one in the denim vest, didn't fit the usual profile. He wasn't loud or demanding. He didn't check his phone every 30 seconds. He just sat there still and silent, his eyes sweeping the room with an unnerving, analytical calm. When she finally approached his table, steeling herself for either dismissal or anger, he looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to see right through the tired waitress uniform to the person underneath. "Good evening," he said, his voice a deep, quiet rumble. "My name is Sarah," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." That single moment of genuine human acknowledgement, as small and insignificant as it seemed, shook something loose inside her. It was a crack in the dam of her carefully constructed composure. Because Sarah wasn't just a waitress carrying plates, she was a witness carrying the weight of every silent injustice, every whispered slur, every unwritten rule that governed this poisoned place. And tonight, as she looked at the quiet man by the kitchen doors, a dangerous thought began to form. She was done just watching. Tonight she might just have to do something, even if it meant burning her own life to the ground. The Route 66 Prime was not a meal. It was an exercise in roadside gluttony, a 20-ounce porterhouse, grilled over mesquite, smothered in bourbon butter, and served on a sizzling cast-iron skillet. It was accompanied by loaded wedges and a tower of onion rings, all for the theatrical price of $50. It was a dish designed for Instagram, a monument to excess. When the man in the vest ordered it, Sarah had to physically stop herself from gaping. The prime, sir?" she stammered, her mind racing. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Medium rare and a black coffee." Another distinct decision made without a moment's hesitation. Sarah had served that exact order maybe 5 times in her entire year at the pit stop. Each time it was to a visiting car club president or a local business owner showing off. It was never ever ordered by a lone biker sitting at the worst table in the house. She felt the heat of a familiar gaze on the back of her neck. Across the dining room, Mr. Miller stood by the hostess stand, arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of suspicion. She knew exactly what he was thinking. This was a dine and dash waiting to happen. This man, this type of man, couldn't possibly afford a meal like this, and if he walked out, the cost of that steak would be taken directly from her pay, a punishment outlined in the fine print of her employment contract. She hesitated for a beat too long. "Is there a problem?" the man asked. His voice was still quiet, but now there was a sharp, steel edge to it. "No, sir, not at all," she said, her professionalism kicking in. "Excellent choice. Coming right up." She turned and walked toward the kitchen's point-of-sale terminal, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped piston. Every server knew the unwritten rule. If a rough trade customer came in, a code word whose meaning was universally understood, and ordered one of the high-ticket items, they were expected to discreetly ask for a credit card to be held before firing the order. It was a humiliating, discriminatory practice, and Miller enforced it with relish. But as Sarah stood before the glowing screen, she made a decision. She wasn't going to do it. She keyed in the order, her fingers flying across the screen. As she expected, the system flagged the order type, and a red pop-up appeared. Manager approval required. She took a deep breath, hit the override button, and swiped her own employee ID card through the reader. She had just personally guaranteed a $50 check based on nothing more than a gut feeling and the way a stranger had looked her in the eye. As she turned to leave, Miller's voice, thick with menace, hissed from behind her. "Did you get his card, Jenkins?" "No, sir," she replied, not breaking her stride. "Then you damn well better hope he pays," he snarled. But Sarah wasn't hoping. She was watching, because something told her this man wasn't here for a steak dinner. He was here for a reckoning. And if he was, she was about to give him all the evidence he could ever need. Sarah Jenkins had witnessed a universe of casual cruelties inside the pit stop's kitchen, but what she saw next ripped away the last thread of her composure. As the order for table 19 came up, Cook Spike, a man whose ego was far bigger than his skill, swaggered over to the grill station. He picked up the magnificent porterhouse with a pair of tongs, holding it aloft for the other cooks to admire. "Look at this," he sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "A king's meal for a... What do you think he is, boys? A drifter? A gang member?" The other line cooks, all sycophants, chuckled dutifully. Sarah stood by the pass, pretending to fill ramekins, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and fury. Then came the act. It was fast, vile, and unmistakable. Spike leaned over the sizzling steak, a twisted, hateful smirk on his face, and hawked. A thick, deliberate glob of spit landed directly on the center of the meat. He then casually flipped the steak, searing the contamination into its flesh as if nothing had happened. One of the younger cooks snickered. "Special seasoning, Spike?" Spike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Call it the road trash special." Sarah froze, a cold dread washing over her. Her mind screamed. Did I just see that? It couldn't have been. It must have been a trick of the light, the steam. But the laughter, the casual way they all turned back to their work, confirmed the horrifying truth. This wasn't an aberration. This was a ritual, and the steak, now beautifully plated and glistening under the heat lamp, was on its way to her station. The rage that erupted inside her was volcanic, so hot and sharp she thought she might scream. But she couldn't. A scene would get her fired, and worse, it would bury the evidence. She glanced out into the dining room and saw the man at table 19, still impossibly calm, still watching. They thought he was nobody, but Sarah was beginning to suspect he was the most important somebody who had ever walked through these doors. And that realization changed the equation completely. She had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice that could define the rest of her life. She could say nothing, deliver the poisoned meal, and protect her job, the job her family was depending on, or she could risk everything on a stranger in a vest. Her hand dove into her apron pocket, fingers closing around a cheap ballpoint pen. She snatched a clean, folded paper napkin from the service stand, her hands trembling so violently she could barely write. The words poured out of her, desperate and jagged. "They call you road trash in the kitchen. They just poisoned your meal." She paused, her mind racing. He needed proof. He needed a weapon. She added another line. "Ask for the kitchen security tapes. They erase them every night." She signed no name. She just folded the napkin into a tight, small square and shoved it deep into her pocket. The expeditor called her name, sliding the heavy skillet with the steak onto the pass. "Order up for 19, Jenkins." Her heart pounded in her ears like a drumbeat of war as she picked up the plate and walked out into the dining room. Her steps were steady, her face a mask of professional calm. The man looked up as she approached. With a grace she didn't know she possessed, she placed the monument of a meal before him. "The Route 66 Prime, sir," she said, her voice a soft, even whisper. "Enjoy." He gave a slight nod. Then, in a single fluid motion, as her right hand reached for his empty coffee mug to refill it, her left hand darted out, slipping the folded napkin onto the table, half hidden beneath the rim of his bread plate. A second later she was gone, melting back into the shadows of the dining room. She hadn't made eye contact. She hadn't said a word. She had just delivered a bomb, and prayed to God the man at table 19 would know how to detonate it. Jackson sat perfectly still for what felt like a full minute, his gaze fixed on the small white square of paper that had appeared on his table. He hadn't touched the steak. He hadn't even picked up his fork. Something in Sarah's demeanor, a frantic urgency hidden beneath layers of practiced calm, had set off every alarm in his system. It wasn't just in her eyes. It was in the slight tremor of her hand, the way she held her breath as she placed the plate down. She had been trying to tell him something without speaking. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and pinched the corner of the folded napkin between his thumb and forefinger. He brought it to his lap below the level of the table and unfolded it. The words scrawled in cheap blue ink seemed to burn themselves onto his retina. "They call you road trash in the kitchen. They just poisoned your meal. Ask for the kitchen security tapes. They erase them every night." His jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. Every ounce of his carefully constructed calm evaporated, replaced by an Arctic rage so pure and cold it felt like ice water flooding his veins. It wasn't the slur that shocked him. He'd been called worse to his face. It wasn't even the act of spitting in his food. As disgusting as it was, he'd eaten far worse in his life on the road. No. What sent a jolt of electricity through his entire body was the calculated systemic evil of it, the casual cruelty, the laughter, the phrase, "They erase them every night." This wasn't a one-time offense. This was a standard operating procedure. This was a culture of hate, carefully protected and routinely practiced. And Sarah, that young woman with the tired eyes, hadn't just been warning him. She was handing him the key to unlock the entire conspiracy. Jackson folded the napkin once, a sharp crease down the middle, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his vest, a piece of evidence now resting against his heart. He pushed the plate and its $50 steak a few inches away from him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cause a scene. He reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out an old, untraceable burner phone he kept for rides like this. He opened a secure, encrypted messaging app and typed a short, precise message to the head of his personal security team in Austin, a former military contractor named David. Code Black. The Pit Stop, Arizona. Secure cloud server backups for all internal camera feeds for the last 90 days. Immediately cross-reference all employee files with disciplinary histories. Silent protocol. Await my command. He hit send. Then he stood up. Across the room, the manager, Mr. Miller, noticed the movement. He saw the untouched, expensive meal and began strutting over, a predatory glint in his eye, ready to demand payment. "Is there a problem with your meal, sir?" Miller asked, his voice oozing false concern. Jackson met his gaze, and for the first time that night, he let a fraction of the cold fury show in his eyes. "I'd like to have a word with you," Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In your office." "Of course, certainly," Miller said, gesturing toward a hallway near the back. "We can discuss a discount?" "Perhaps we won't be discussing a discount," Jackson said, cutting him off. They walked into the cluttered, windowless office. Miller sat behind his large metal desk, assuming the position of power. Jackson remained standing. Miller launched into a pre-rehearsed speech about customer satisfaction and the culinary arts. It was all meaningless noise. After a full minute of it, Jackson held up a hand. "Show me the live feed from your kitchen cameras," he commanded. Miller's oily smile faltered. I beg your pardon. The cameras are for security and loss prevention, not for—" "I want to see them right now," Jackson repeated. In that instant, the dynamic in the room shifted. The mask of the drifter customer fell away, replaced by the unmistakable aura of absolute authority. The president had entered the building. Miller hesitated, a flicker of panic in his eyes. It was all the confirmation Jackson needed. "The kitchen cameras," Jackson said again, his voice now dropping to a near whisper, each word landing like a chip of ice. "Let's review the footage from the last 30 minutes, specifically the time my meal was being prepared." Miller began to sweat, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. "Well, that might be difficult. The system, you see, it archives in hourly blocks, and sometimes if the hard drive is full, it loops over itself. It's an older system, you understand?" "Cut the crap!" Jackson snapped, the words cracking like a whip in the small room. Miller flinched. "I am going to give you exactly one opportunity to be on the right side of what's about to happen," Jackson said, taking a slow step towards the desk. "You can either be the man who helps me expose a rot in this diner, or you can be the man who goes down with it. Your choice." Miller's face had gone pale, the color of old parchment. He still tried one last pathetic bluff. "Sir, with all due respect, I have to ask, who exactly are you to be making these demands?" Jackson leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the scratched desk, his face just inches from Miller's. "I'm the man who owns the bricks and mortar of this building. I'm the man who owns the logo on the sign outside. I'm the man who signs the checks that pay your salary," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "And I swear to God, if one more lie comes out of your mouth, you will never work in this state or any other again." Miller's jaw went slack. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Wordlessly, he stood, his hands trembling, and turned to a monitor in the corner. He clicked through a few screens, his movements clumsy and panicked. The footage from the kitchen appeared. He scrolled back. And then, right at the timestamp Jackson was looking for, the feed jumped. A clean surgical cut. 2 minutes and 34 seconds of time vanished into thin air, a digital black hole right where the crime would have been. Miller feigned surprise, tapping at the keyboard. "See, like I said, the system glitches." Jackson stopped him with a single word. "Enough." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside the door, the diner hummed along, oblivious. Inside, a world was ending. Jackson pulled out his burner phone again and sent a second message to his security chief. "Local footage has been tampered with. Manager is complicit. His name is Miller. Secure his office computer. Preserve all digital and paper files. I'm on my way out." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at the man who was now visibly shaking behind the desk. "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately," Jackson said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Walk me to the front door, then go home. And if I were you, my first call would be to a very good lawyer." Mr. Miller, his face a mask of ruin, didn't argue. The storm had just made landfall, and he was standing at ground zero. The 40-minute ride to his hotel on the outskirts of Phoenix felt like an eternity. Jackson didn't bother with the radio. He rode in complete silence, the rhythmic thrum of the engine the only sound. He needed focus. He needed to compartmentalize the white-hot rage that was threatening to consume him. By the time he walked through the doors of his suite, his team had already moved mountains. A new encrypted laptop sat waiting for him on the desk overlooking the valley. His security chief, David, was on the screen via a secure video link. "We have it, Jax," David said, his voice calm and professional. "They were sloppy. They deleted the local server files, but they forgot about the mandatory cloud backups that are part of our insurance policy. We have every uncut second from every camera for the past 3 months. Jackson nodded, took a deep breath, and sat down. "Play it." He poured himself a glass of water, his hand steady as a rock, and opened the file labeled Pit Stop Kitchen Main. And there it was, time-stamped, high-def, undeniable. He watched Spike lean over the porterhouse. He saw the smirk, the deliberate and disgusting act. He saw the other cooks laughing. The camera's microphone was sensitive enough to pick up the audio, a tiny, distorted sound. But the words were clear. "That's what you get for acting like you own the road," Spike had muttered. Jackson felt nothing. No shock, no surprise, just the cold, hard confirmation of a cancer he now had to excise. He had David scrub through the previous weeks of footage. It was worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't an isolated incident fueled by a bad mood. It was a pattern. A week prior, a group of older riders on touring bikes were seated at the same terrible table. The footage showed their order being deliberately held back for 45 minutes. In the kitchen, Spike took their burgers, dropped them on the greasy floor, kicked them under a prep table, then picked them up and threw them back on the grill, all to the roaring laughter of his staff. 2 weeks before that, a solo female rider had complained about her coffee being cold. The cameras showed her waitress, one of the few who seemed uncomfortable with the kitchen's culture, taking the cup back. Spike took the cup, topped it off with tap water from the mop sink, and then instructed another cook to sneeze near it before sending it back out. It was a litany of hate, a secret history of daily abuse, all meticulously documented and stored on a server he owned. They had used his own security system to record their crimes. The irony was so bitter, it almost made him laugh. He had David save and encrypt the files, sending them to 3 separate locations: his lead counsel, his head of public relations, and a private server that only he could access. The instructions he sent were brief and clear: full legal and civil complaints to be drawn up against Spike, Miller, and any complicit staff. Full internal review of all HR practices. Prepare a public statement. No one moves until I give the word. We go public in 24 hours. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the distant lights of the highway below. They hadn't just insulted a customer. They hadn't just disrespected a biker. They had exposed a sickness that he, as the owner, was ultimately responsible for. They thought they were humiliating a nobody in a vest. They had no idea they had just handed a king the evidence he needed to burn their corrupt little kingdom to the ground, and the fire was coming. The next morning, Sarah Jenkins showed up for her shift, feeling like a ghost. She hadn't slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night in a torturous loop. Each passing minute she expected a call from Miller, a summon to his office. The cold final words: "You're fired." She had committed career suicide, and for what? For a man she didn't know, for a principle that the world seemed to have forgotten. But when she walked through the staff entrance, the atmosphere was strange. The usual morning buzz was replaced with a tense, anxious silence. No one made eye contact. People whispered in corners, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Before she could even clock in, the young hostess from the night before ran up to her, her face pale. "Sarah, Mr. Vance's lawyer is here. He wants to see you now." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Mr. Vance?" she whispered. "The owner," the hostess said, her eyes wide. "He's cleaning house. Miller's gone. Spike, too." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She straightened her apron, her hands trembling, and walked the long, silent hallway to the manager's office. She braced herself for a lawyer in a pinstriped suit. She expected to be handed a severance check and a non-disclosure agreement. What she didn't expect to see was him, the man from table 19. He was standing by the window, no longer in the dusty vest, but in a clean, sharp button-down shirt that probably cost more than her car. The quiet observer was gone. In his place stood a man who radiated an almost terrifying level of power and authority. He turned as she entered. "Sarah Jenkins," he said, his voice the same deep rumble, but now it held the weight of command. He motioned to the chair in front of the desk. She remained standing. You're him," she managed to say. "My name is Jackson Vance," he said. "And yes, I own this diner," he paused, "and I owe you my gratitude." Her mind was spinning. Am I fired?" she asked, the words tumbling out. He almost smiled. "Fired? Ms. Jenkins, you're the only person in this entire establishment who I am certain should keep their job." He gestured again to the chair, and this time her legs gave out and she sank into it. "I've reviewed the camera footage," he said, his voice softening slightly. "All of it. I saw what they did to my meal. I saw what they've been doing to countless others for months, if not years. I saw a culture of hate that I allowed to grow under my own roof." Sarah looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her apron. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the one thing that mattered," Jackson replied, his voice firm. "You told the truth." He took a breath, his expression turning serious. "So this is where we are. I can burn this place to the ground. I can fire every last person, sell the building, and erase the pit stop from the map. And a part of me wants to do exactly that. But before I do, I want to offer you a choice." Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with confusion. "A choice?" "Yes," he said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Option 1, you can walk away from all of this. I will personally pay off your student debts, and I will write you a check large enough to ensure you and your family are secure. You can finish your certification, pursue your dream, and never have to think about this place again. No one would blame you." She stared at him, speechless. "Or," Jackson continued, his gaze intense, "there's option 2. You can stay. You can stay and help me rebuild this place from the foundation up. Help me turn a symbol of exclusion into a beacon of the road. I'm creating a new position effective immediately, Director of Rider Relations and Culture. It comes with a seat on the executive board and the authority to enact real, meaningful change. The job is yours if you want it." A long silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of the offer. "You would trust me with that?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice shaking. Jackson nodded slowly. "Miss Jenkins, I already trusted you with my gut. This is the easy part." And for the first time in a very, very long time, Sarah Jenkins took a full, deep breath, and it didn't feel like she was suffocating. It felt like hope. The 24 hours that followed were a blur of surgical precision. By 10 a.m., the pit stop was no longer a diner. It was the headquarters for a corporate coup. Jackson Vance moved with the swift, decisive energy of a road captain. His legal team had flown in from Austin on a private charter before dawn. His crisis PR team was already putting the final touches on a press release that would detonate in the enthusiast media, but Jackson wasn't going to hide behind a statement. Not for this. At exactly 12:30 p.m., just as the usual lunch crowd was beginning to arrive, 2 black SUVs and a sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb outside. The doors opened, and 4 health inspectors and 2 deputies stepped out. They didn't storm the building. They didn't need to. They walked calmly through the front doors, presented a warrant to the terrified hostess, and proceeded directly to the kitchen. Spike was in the middle of yelling at a line cook. He didn't even have time to take off his apron before he was cited. The sous chef, who had laughed at his joke, was next. Then 2 deputies went to Mr. Miller's home and served him papers on his front lawn. 3 citations one morning. The charges ranged from gross health code violations to reckless endangerment. The remaining staff stood in stunned silence. Some stared in disbelief. A few of the busboys and the other mechanic-minded waitress exchanged quiet, triumphant glances. This is the moment everything changed. And if you're feeling that fire in your gut right now, that roar of approval for justice served, do me a favor and hit that like button. Let the world know that stories like this matter. Now hold on tight, because the public takedown was just beginning. Outside, on the front porch of the now closed diner, a podium and microphones had been set up. Reporters tipped off by Jackson's PR team were already swarming. Jackson stepped up to the podium, not with fury, but with a cold, hard gravity. "Yesterday, I came to this establishment as a writer, hoping to enjoy a meal," he began, his voice clear and steady, carrying over the clicks of the cameras. "Today, I stand here as its owner, ashamed of what I allowed to happen within these walls. What I discovered here was not the result of 1 or 2 bad apples. It was the result of a poisoned root system, a culture of discrimination and disrespect that was allowed to fester in darkness. That darkness ends today." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot Arizona air. Then he gestured to his right, where Sarah stood, poised and resolute in a simple professional shirt his assistant had procured for her that morning. She didn't smile or wave. She just stood with a quiet strength that commanded more respect than any shouting ever could. The only reason this truth came to light is because of the extraordinary courage of this young woman, Sarah Jenkins, Jackson announced, his voice ringing with conviction. She risked her job, her safety, and her future to stand up for what is right. She represents the very best of this community, and she will be the compass that guides this institution forward. A smattering of applause broke out, genuine and heartfelt. Jackson concluded with one final, powerful statement. "The pit stop, as you knew it, is closed permanently. But we are not running away. We are rebuilding. And when these doors reopen, this will be a place that doesn't just serve food. It will be a place that serves everyone, 2 wheels or 4, with dignity, with respect, and with justice. No spin, no corporate doublespeak, just the raw, unvarnished truth delivered for the entire world to see." Sarah Jenkins had never owned an article of clothing that cost more than her monthly rent. Until now. In the 2 weeks that followed the press conference, the pit stop remained dark to the public, a silent monument on the dusty highway. But inside, it was a hive of activity. The kitchen was stripped down to the studs. The patronizing photos were taken down and donated to a local historical society. The very air inside seemed to be changing, and at the center of this whirlwind was Sarah, sitting at a brand new desk in the office that had once belonged to Mr. Miller. The title on her door still felt foreign, Director of Rider Relations. It sounded like a corporate buzzword, but Jackson had been clear. "It's not a title," he had told her. "It's a mission. Your job is to be the conscience of this company." Her first official act was to call an all-staff meeting. No podiums, no PowerPoint presentations, just a large circle of chairs arranged in the center of the empty dining room. She looked out at the faces of her former colleagues. Some looked at her with awe, others with resentment, most with uncertainty. She told her story simply and without embellishment. She spoke about the fear she felt and the moral conviction that outweighed it. She didn't place blame. She explained the failure of a culture that allowed silence to become complicity. She announced a new, truly anonymous reporting system for workplace grievances managed by an independent third party. She rolled out mandatory intensive respect and safety training for every single employee, starting with the executive team. She instituted weekly town hall meetings where any employee could voice concerns without fear of retribution. And she started hiring. She brought in a new head chef, a celebrated BBQ master from Texas, known for his kindness as much as his brisket. She promoted one of the quiet busboys, a young guy who loved vintage engines, to a junior management position. She was rebuilding the diner's staff to look like the road it served. She also did something for herself. With Jackson's full backing and a scholarship from a new foundation he had established, she re-enrolled at the technical college, taking night classes to finish her mechanical engineering degree. Because she knew the fight didn't end at the pit stop's doors, people started to notice. Motorcycle clubs reached out. Other service industry workers began calling her, sharing their own stories of abuse and discrimination. She wasn't just a director in a diner anymore. She was becoming a voice. She walked differently now, with a confidence that came not from a title, but from the knowledge that she had faced down her greatest fear and won. She still served people, but it wasn't burgers and fries anymore. It was hope. It was justice. And the world was finally listening. In the end, it wasn't the health department or the lawyers or the television cameras that brought down the corrupt kingdom of the pit stop. It was a 12-word message scribbled on a cheap paper napkin, a silent scream for help that was finally heard. One small act of defiant courage was all it took to expose a deep-seated rot hiding behind the facade of Americana and roadside charm. It lit a fire that didn't just destroy. It cleansed. It revealed the ugly truth of what was already there. The lesson in this story isn't just about bad cooks or judgmental managers. It's about the immense untapped power that resides in ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Sarah Jenkins didn't have an army. She didn't have a title or a platform. But she had a conscience. She saw something fundamentally wrong, and instead of turning away, she acted. She didn't need to shout. She just needed to write the truth and hand it to someone who was willing to listen. And that is the powerful beating heart of this story. Sometimes the most heroic act isn't a grand public gesture. It's a quiet, terrified decision to risk everything, your job, your security, your future, to defend a principle larger than yourself. And it is the solemn duty of those who hold power like Jackson Vance to not only listen to those whispers, but to amplify them into a roar of transformative action. And because he did, an empire didn't just avoid a scandal. It found its soul. So now I have to ask you, what injustice, big or small, have you witnessed and remained silent about? What poison have you seen served that you chose to ignore? And more importantly, what in your world might change if you found the courage to finally write your own napkin? If this story moved you, if it stirred something inside you, do more than just think about it. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that one person, one voice, can still change the world. And if you want more stories like this, the real ones, the raw ones, the ones that challenge us to be better, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, because history shows us time and time again that the biggest revolutions don't always start with an explosion. Sometimes they start with a whisper. Sometimes all it takes is a napkin and the simple world-changing courage to write the truth on it. What did you take away from Sarah and Jackson's story? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments below.